Uh, my name is Amir Garakani. I am the Director of Education here at Silver Hill Hospital. I'm also one of the attending psychiatrists. I'm very happy to have Dr. Joel Weinberger coming today to speak about the unconscious, what took so long, what we know, and clinical implications. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Dr. Andrew Gerber, who is the President and Medical Director of Silver Hill, and he will give a formal introduction and a background on Dr. Weinberger. But first, a couple of housekeeping measures. We love to hear from you. If you have questions during the talk, you can look at the bottom of the screen. There's a Q&A box. You can submit your questions there, and Dr. Weinberger will get to those questions at the end of the talk. We'll have around 15 minutes or so at the end for questions. Also, if you want to receive CME or CEC credits, it will pop up in your screen, a box where you can fill out a survey to get the credits, or it'll be emailed to you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrew Gerber, who will introduce our speaker. Andrew?
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Amir. So I was thinking about this, when I emailed Amir and Ann and Jane to say I wanted to do the introduction today. There's different reasons I sometimes ask to do the introductions. Amir does such a great job. He doesn't need my help. But one of the reasons I asked to do things is when I just have an enormous amount of personal affection for the speaker, and that is the case today. In addition to being a very accomplished researcher and clinical psychologist and person, Joel is just one of my favorite people in the world, I have to say, and I don't get to see or hear from him nearly enough, particularly with COVID, and we all have busy lives. But to have the chance to talk about Joel and to listen to his wonderful talk is really a highlight of my week, my month, my year, and I'm really glad you're all here to meet Joel as well. Let me say a little bit about him. So Joel got his undergraduate degree at SUNY Stony Brook, pursued his Ph.D. in psychology at the New School for Social Research in New York, which you know is a fascinating psychology program that has produced some really wonderful minds. And very importantly for his career, did a postdoc after his PhD at Harvard in the Henry Murray Research Center there with a man named David McClellan. And those of you who know the history of psychology in the last 50 years know that McClellan was really a giant of the study of personality and of human motivation, wrote some of the seminal textbooks in the field. Not someone who's particularly thought of as being a psychoanalytic person, but that doesn't matter. I mean, the things that Joel is presenting on here really transcend these sort of more sectarian identities, and it's really about profound human truths. And McClellan really was a foundational figure, and so I think really shaped Joel's career and shaped who he is. It's important also to note that Joel's PhD was done with a man named Lloyd Silverman, who's sadly passed away fairly young. But Lloyd was a mainstay of a group called the Rappaport-Klein Group, which I had the privilege to be involved in particularly when I was at Austin Riggs, and which Joel is a member of and had presented to as well. But there was an era that we don't talk about as much now where psychoanalysts like Lloyd Silverman really were at the forefront of research. And Joel is a part of that tradition. And it's a tradition that I think is unfortunately not as common as it once was, but someone who thinks broadly, aggregates all the information, and really with the perspective of wanting to understand human beings better so that we can help them. And that really obviously brings his mission and his perspective very near and dear to the heart of Silver Hill. I know I'm going a little long, but I want to say a couple more quick things before I turn things over to Joel. Really, for pretty much all his career since 1988, he's been at the Derner Institute at Adelphi, going from assistant to associate to full professor, where he's been for almost 20 years. He's a beloved colleague and teacher there, and everybody who's ever studied at Derner, and there's a lot of them out there, including many on our staff, remembers Joel for his courses and for his generosity to his students and his research. But the last thing I want to say is to mention three personal images that I have of Joel. Two that I've actually seen with my own eyes, one that I only conjure up, but they're all to me very, very meaningful, and I wanted to share them with you. The first is of Joel with his two sons, who I haven't seen in years, but adorable, smart, thoughtful young men. Joel and his wife, who's also a psychologist, did a fantastic job. And I picture Joel wearing his Yankees cap and coaching these boys who are just delightful. And I wish I got to see them more. That's my second image, a little comic, is I don't know if Joel's going to talk about it all today, but one of his areas of research, very important area of research, was using subliminal stimuli of spiders. And he had this tarantula named Fuzzy, who he kept in a cage in his house. And I had the privilege of borrowing Fuzzy, and my kids loved Fuzzy. And I imagine Fuzzy is with us no more, but I picture Joel and Fuzzy, and somehow that makes me smile. But the last one is a little bit of a sad, but also an important image in my mind, which is Joel probably regrets that he told me this, but I know that in the early part of Joel's career, when he was at Adelphi, there were two other very, very important and brilliant clinical psychologists, and they called them the 3 J's. One was Joel. Another was Jonathan Shedler, who many of you are aware is a very important influence on the field. I have some differences of opinion with, but I have a great deal of respect. And the third is Jeremy Safran. And I picture the 3 J's together, 3 brilliant, men with huge hearts who cared about their patients and cared about the field. And all that the 3 of them have contributed. As many of you are probably aware, Jeremy Safran died way too young just a few years ago. But I'm so fortunate that I feel so fortunate we have Joel with us today. And I know you'll enjoy the talk as I will. And I will turn it over to you, Joel, now for Grand Rounds. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you, Andrew. I don't know how to follow that other than to say for $20, I got a lot. Check is in the mail. I also want to thank Dr. Garakani, for whom I just met and is a fellow Yankee fan. Jane for organizing this, and Ann for helping. And I'm going to share screen now and begin my talk. And hopefully I'll live up to part of what Andrew had to say. So there's you see the inside of my head from on my screen, but I'll get rid of that and do a more organized talk than the inside of my head. There we are. Okay, so my talk, as you were told, is the unconscious. What took so long, what we know, some clinical implications. I'm also going to throw in some political implications because of the times we live in. I decided to discuss some studies we did there. And as Dr. Gerber said, I'm a professor at Adelphi. I have a consulting company that consults with politicians, nonprofits, and sometimes businesses. And I just wrote this book, so the unconscious is in my head. And thank you for agreeing to have me here. So here I am. So first thing I have to do, I'm told, is disclose that I don't have any financial relationships to disclose in relation to this presentation. Sometimes I wish I did, but in fact I don't. So let's get started. Here's what I hope will happen today. I hope that I'm going to show you why unconscious processes, which most of you, I presume, are clinicians and take them for granted, in fact, in Western culture and society and philosophy and psychology, were ignored or denied for a long time. And I want to explain why that was. And when I say a long time, I'm talking centuries, from the beginning of our field with Wundt and going back centuries before that. So I'll cover that in 5 minutes. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the areas of research that are myriad now, that mention and that study unconscious processes systematically. And I'll try and touch on a clinical implication of each of them. I won't have time to get deeply into it. I talk about it quite a bit in my book, but I'll try and touch on it here. Then I'm going to do an audience participation exercise, which always makes me nervous to do on Zoom, and hope that it works, because what I'd like to do is demonstrate that these processes are real, and I can't think of a better way than for you to feel them, and hopefully that'll happen. And if it does work, afterwards I'll show you how these processes have developed in people normatively. And finally, as I said, I'm going to go over some political findings that are related to unconscious processes. So let's get started. So what took so long for us to study systematically unconscious processes? And the answer is this guy, who some of you might remember. His name is Rene Descartes. And what did he do to screw up the study of unconscious processes? We all know that Descartes famously said in Latin, cogito ergo sum, which translates to the famous I think, therefore I am, which actually, and I'll explain in a minute, really translates to I am aware, therefore I am. So he went on to argue, Descartes did, that based on his rational thinking and his studies, that the universe consists of two qualitatively different substances, and only two substances, the mental and the physical. And you could tell they were different qualitatively because the physical takes up space. The physical has weight. You can touch it. You can pick it up. You can cut pieces out of it. You can weigh it. The mental doesn't have any of those properties and is defined by thought. And that's it. That's the whole universe. There's nothing else. That's his ontology, to use the technical term. So what does that have to do with the unconscious? Why am I bothering you with this? Well, first I'll repeat. That's all there is. There's the mental and there's the physical and nothing else. And the mental is defined by consciousness, because you cannot say, I think, but I really don't know what I'm thinking. I'm unconscious of it, therefore I am. You have to say instead, I am aware, therefore I am. So one can retranslate, I think, therefore I am, to I am aware, therefore I am. And that means that anything unconscious can't be mental, because mental is defined by definition with awareness. And it therefore either doesn't exist or it has to be physical, because that's all there is. There's nothing else in the universe. So there we were, and there we were stuck for a while. I won't go into all of the different effects over the centuries. I discussed it elsewhere if anyone wants to be bored by that kind of stuff. But when psychology was founded as a discipline by Wundt and later taken over in the US by Titchener, it defined itself literally as the study of consciousness. Psychology was defined at its inception as the study of consciousness, and it explicitly denied and excluded unconscious processes. And in a way, that got even more extreme when behaviorism came about a couple of decades later, a few decades later, actually, because they basically said there is no mental. So they even eliminated consciousness and only studied the physical, namely in the form of behavior. And that's how it was in the field of psychology for decades and decades, essentially until what has come to be called the cognitive revolution, with one exception. And that exception is psychoanalysis, which those of you, I imagine several of you, I know Andrew is, Dr. Gerber, are intimately familiar with. And the unconscious is central to psychoanalysis. At one point, Freud said psychoanalysis is the study of the unconscious, going all the way back to chapter 8 of the Interpretation of Dreams. I personally recommend a 1915 paper by Freud called The Unconscious, very original name. But there was a problem as far as researchers, academics, and other thinkers of that ilk were concerned. It wasn't studied in universities for the most part. It was restricted to institutes and to practice. It didn't rely, that's actually a misnomer for me to say, on empirical investigation, because it did rely on experience. It didn't rely on traditional scientific research. And the unconscious I want to talk about, I call the normative unconscious, unconscious in everyday activity, but psychoanalysis focused on things going wrong, understandably, and on psychotherapy. And so for those three reasons, even though psychoanalysis was studying the unconscious and talking about the unconscious, the neglect of it in the academy and in public discourse was enormous. And then everything changed. And it started to change in the late 1980s with the cognitive revolution. As soon as we started to think stuff is going on between the ears, and we started to realize we can't verbally discuss everything that's going on between our ears, the unconscious started to reemerge and make an appearance and be studied systematically. And now you can't pick up a journal. They changed the name from unconscious to implicit. There's a story if someone wants to hear where we tried to publish a paper using the word unconscious, and had to change it to implicit so it would be accepted. And that's all we did was change the wording. But in any case, you can't pick up a psychology journal or read the popular press anymore without looking at implicit processes. And I'm going to just list some of the areas that are systematically studying them and then quickly go over each. And obviously, I have to be quick with just the hour I have today. There's cognitive heuristics associated with Kahneman and Tversky. There's implicit memory. There's implicit learning. There's implicit motivation. Dr. Gerber mentioned that I studied with Professor McClelland, and that's mostly what we studied there. There's attribution theory, which is part of social psychology for the most part. There's automaticity. There's embodied cognition. And then there's this whole debate about whether cognition or affect should be privileged, which I think is mistaken, but nonetheless, it's an area of research that's very vibrant nowadays. I'll talk about why I think that in a few minutes, I hope. Okay, let's start with cognitive heuristics. It's a fancy term for a shortcut so that we don't have to think through things. It's a cognitive strategy for making a judgment or solving a problem that, according to Kahneman and Tversky, evolved in us such that we don't engage in rational thinking. We just go through these shortcut strategies that they call heuristics. And they evolved to work, so mostly they work. But in their brilliant research, they created situations to show that they can come to very strange but predictable erroneous conclusions if you set up the situation correctly. I mean, they evolved to work in the Pleistocene era, 10,000 years ago, at least, and we don't live there anymore. So we can now show the errors and the flaws there. And as I mentioned, Kahneman, Tversky unfortunately passed away young, but Kahneman, I think, deservedly won a Nobel Prize in economics for demonstrating this aspect of human functioning. And I'm going to try and show it in action in that audience participation demonstration that I talked about, as well as some other aspects of unconscious processes. Okay, implicit memory. Implicit memory is what we call it when a person demonstrates they've been influenced by something, so we know that it happened to them. We know that therefore they must have a memory of it. But if you ask them, they say, no, that never happened. I don't remember anything of the sort. So you can measure the effect of something that happened in the past on what they're thinking, feeling, and doing now. And yet they'll say they don't recall it. And we see this in therapy all the time. Our patients reveal things about themselves that we can infer as clinicians indicate an experience that they've had in the past. But they deny or tell you that they have no recollection of the experience. I'll give you one quick and obvious example. My older son, Dr. Gerber mentioned that I have two sons. My older son, at 15 months, and I remember it because it was exactly when my second son was born, they're 15 months apart, was in daycare while my wife was in the hospital. And someone was kind enough to slam a door on his finger, which was almost severed. And I was called to the emergency room, and I had to leave the hospital where Aiden had just been born. And there he was with his finger hanging. And a hand surgeon came to sew the finger back on, essentially. It was not totally severed, but it was hanging. And he told me, you don't have to worry. He's only 15 months old. He won't remember anything of this. And I wanted to slug him because I know about implicit memory, but you don't slug a surgeon before he's about to fix your son. So I said nothing. And he fixed my son, and his finger looks a little funny now, but it's mostly okay. And he has use of it, so it all worked. Except he doesn't like the sound of slamming doors now. And if I ask him why he doesn't like the sound of slamming doors, he says it's loud, it startled him, it's an obnoxious sound. But I know why he doesn't like the sound of slamming doors. And he has no memory of this event. He has a memory of me telling him about it. But that's an example of implicit memory. And our patients show these kinds of things all the time. So implicit learning. Implicit learning refers to A happens, then B happens. We may not be aware that they're going together in time, sequentially, but we learn that they go together such that we come to believe that A causes B. and the person doesn't realize what they've learned, and the person doesn't even realize oftentimes that they've learned anything at all. So our patients have unconsciously learned to do certain things, to cope in certain ways, to have certain beliefs that they are unaware of or maybe deny. So if you have a patient, for example, that dissociates, they probably learned to do that and have forgotten when and how they learned to do that. But now when they come into a difficult situation, they dissociate. Or they have a substance abuse disorder and they've learned to go to a substance, but they don't remember how they learned it or when they learned it, but we know they've learned it. So that's an example of implicit learning. Could have occurred early, a lot of times it has, could occur later in life, but it occurs outside of awareness. And we know that this kind of learning goes on all the time. Implicit motivation. This is what I studied with Professor McClelland, and we found a lot of motives. I'll name a couple of them, but I won't go deeply into them. Achievement motivation, power motivation, affiliative motivation, intimacy motivation, and oneness motivation are the main ones. They're pre-verbal, so you can't really talk about them. You measure them by the stories people tell you. They develop early in life. We had a paper in Psych Review, actually the paper where we had to change the word unconscious to implicit, where we showed that these motives could be traced back to early infantile experiences. The mother reported how she raised the kids early on, and then we measured the adult motives at age 31 and 41. It's a long-term study. And we found certain precursors to these implicit motives. Well, they're not accessible for the most part to conscious awareness. So to measure them, we usually provide TAT type stories. That's a card that has a vague, has a picture on it that can be subject to many interpretations, and any other kind of spontaneous verbal production, which is exactly what our patients provide us when we're talking to them. So we can infer the implicit motives by how a patient talks to us. Are they interested in intimate relationships? Are they interested in doing better than they did before? Are they interested in being dominant over others? They may not know that they're interested in these things, that they're motivated by these things, but their stories tell us that. And we know clinically that our patients will profess to want certain things. They want to be loved. I want to be a great parent. I want to have a good relationship. Well, then why aren't you? And the answer is partly is implicit learning, partly is a lot of other things, but partly because they're not motivated in that direction. They're motivated in other directions. And so they're in a career path that doesn't work for them, or they're not getting gratification out of life. So we know that implicit motivation matters. Attribution theory, that comes from social psychology. And we are organisms that need to explain things to ourselves. We need to find meaning in things. So we need to explain the actions of others. We need to explain our own actions, whether we have access to the real reasons or not. And it turns out there's a bias built into it. And the bias, when you think about it, makes sense. But what the bias is somebody else behaves. That's because of who they are. That's because of their personality. But when I behave, it's because of the environment. So the example I like to give my students, we see this clinically all the time, but an obvious one, I'm on the highway and someone cuts me off. Well, that person is a jerk. I don't wonder whether they were in a hurry, whether they have to go to the hospital, what motivated them to cut me off. I just give them a personality attribute. On the other hand, when I cut somebody off, well, they were going too slowly. Anyone else would cut them off. I'm late for an appointment. So there's a bias to see the activity of others, the behavior of others as due to their personality, but our own behavior is due to the environment. So what happens clinically? What happens when you're talking to a patient? The patient explains to you why they did something. There's always a reason. They're late because the subway didn't come on time. There was a lot of traffic, except that they're always late. So they will explain their behavior as dependent on the situation. A therapist, and we have work that shows this, is more likely to attribute the patient's behavior to their personality. And what happens then sometimes? We have a rupture, a therapeutic rupture. The therapist says, my patient is resistant, doesn't want to accept what I'm saying. And the patient says, the therapist is unempathic, doesn't realize the pressures I'm under or why I really did something, wants to tell me that I have this personality. And it might be one of those, but it also might be neither of those. It might be this normative, implicit attributional bias that I just mentioned to you. Namely, the patient is normatively constructed to say it's the environment, and the therapist is normatively constructed to say it's the personality. So we need to go more deeply into what happened. And to understand these biases, only in that way can we really find out whether it's the patient's personality or the environmental situation. And I think we need to understand that these biases are not dynamically based, they're normative. And they're normative because the information that you have watching someone else's behavior is just the behavior. You don't have insight into the context and the constraints, whereas the person behaving, their personality is always with them, so they're not watching their personality, they're seeing the environment. So they got angry, and anyone would get angry. And you see a person who gets angry easily, and therefore has anger issues, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, automaticity. Once a mental process of any sort, whether it began consciously or began unconsciously, is rehearsed, namely is repeated, it starts to develop its own energy. It starts to operate autonomously. It starts to operate automatically. And usually that's a good thing. I shouldn't have to learn how to drive a car every time I get into a car. I shouldn't have to learn how to read every time I open the social media or a book. But it can go wrong as well. So if I behave maladaptively, maybe it was once adaptive, but now it's not adaptive, doesn't matter how I learned it, doesn't matter what motivated originally, if I repeat this behavior often enough, it's going to take on a life of its own, and it's going to maintain itself autonomously. So it's not because I'm motivated to be this way, and I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I'm just saying there's this too. It's because I simply took a process that's normally adaptive and adaptation enhancing, and right now it's not working because I'm automatically repeating a behavior that doesn't work well. What could I give an example? I engaged in a certain coping mechanism when I was 7 years old to deal with abusive parents, and I've maintained that way of relating, but now I'm 27 years old, but I practiced it so often, it's all I know. And sometimes we call that transference. Okay. Well, the clinical application of this is first to understand that it exists. And second, the same automatic mechanisms that create the maladaptive behavior in the first place may also hold the key to changing those maladaptive behaviors. So if in the course of therapy, you identify a better way of coping, a better way of functioning, you need to make that automatic. The patient can't constantly be on guard and notice. And we know this, the patient relapses, the patient comes in and says, oh yeah, but I did it again, and so on and so forth. So after making the unconscious conscious, after making the patient aware of what she or he does, we need to make the conscious unconscious by having them learn this new coping mechanism and practice it enough so that it, if not supplants, at least competes with the old maladaptive coping mechanism. Okay, embodied cognition. This is really relatively new in cognitive science and so on. I think psychoanalysis has referred to it obliquely, but never directly. Now it does. It refers to the idea that what goes on inside your head is actually coded in a physical way, coded in a sensory and motor way. Let me explain what I mean. So when we say something like, I feel warmly towards somebody, we all understand that that means I feel positively, I feel more intimate, but we assume warm is just a metaphor that doesn't have any concrete meaning. But it turns out that it does. And there are studies that have been done where if you actually hold something warm, you will feel more positively towards the next person you meet, literally something warm. We know that if we raise the temperature of a room, not to an uncomfortable degree, but just a little bit, people will be friendlier. And the opposite is true. When people feel positively towards someone, they will estimate the temperature in a room to be a little warmer. Why? Because it's actually coded the same way. The word warm is literally what's going on. The same circuits are being activated. Likewise, distance. I feel close to someone. Well, I feel close to my wife, but she's not here. So how am I close? That spatial metaphor is literally the case. If you show people dots closer together, they will assume they relate better than if you show them further apart. That's how literal it is. What that means is that we all knew that metaphor was a powerful clinical tool, but we now know kind of why and how to use it. So if I'm depressed and I feel burdened and I feel heavy, I literally feel burdened and heavy. And perhaps the metaphor of lifting the burden or getting something off my shoulders is going to work at the level of the physical and help me. So hopefully I'm making sense. And also it indicates that nonverbal behavior, which we all know is important, is actually more important than we thought because they're coded similarly. So, well, I'll get into that when I talk about neural reuse, an example of what I mean. Okay. Affect versus cognition. This has been an argument in psychology and clinically as far back as I can remember, where one is primary, the other one is secondary, one is dominant, the other one is subservient. So if I'm into cognitive therapy, I privilege cognition. If I change the way I think, my affect will follow. If I'm psychodynamic or humanistic, I'll privilege affect. I must get to the emotional tone of the experience, and then the cognition will follow. So which is it? Well, the answer is yes. Both of them are correct, and both of them are wrong. What the research seems to show now is it's not whether it's cognitive or whether it's affective, it's what's most salient in the experience to the person, in this case to the patient, and what fits best with the person's self-image. So if what's salient in the experience is an affective aspect of it, then that's going to be how things need to be understood. If it's more of a way of thinking, then that has to be what's understood. And if it's consistent with the patient's view of reality. So if you have a depressed patient, the depressed patient will notice and find salient things that support the world is a terrible place. Nothing I do matters. And you can demonstrate to them till the cows come home, excuse me, that things are not as bad as they think. And this is what lay people try and do. What are you complaining about? You have a good life. It doesn't matter because that's not what's salient to them. And that could be affective and it could be cognitive. So the therapist is best served by focusing on what's most salient rather than by either cognition or affect, whether it be cognition or affect. And that's what needs to be focused on in the treatment, I would argue. Okay. So those are the areas. What I want to talk about now is where agreement is on how unconscious processes operate. And I want to emphasize again, I'm talking about a normative unconscious. And that's what I believe is really what mostly happens. It can go wrong, but mostly it goes right. Because think about it, would we have evolved a pathological unconscious? Why would evolution say, yes, you need to be neurotic? Rather, evolution favors something that helps us to operate positively in the environment in which it evolved. And sometimes it goes wrong. That's really how I understand it. I think that's the way to understand it. So the first thing we know, there's the usual iceberg metaphor. You know, what's above the surface is consciousness, what's below is unconscious. I had to do that because you're supposed to do that. But what's really relevant here is what we now know is there's no pure conscious process. There's no pure unconscious process. Everything is a mix of the two. Now, the relative mix of how much consciousness and how much unconsciousness exists in a behavior and a thought and a feeling can vary, but you never have 100% of one or 100% of another. And I'm giving an example. I'm talking and I'm conscious of what I'm saying. I'm conscious of talking to you. So you would say I'm behaving consciously. Where'd the words come from? I don't have a little guy in my head looking in a dictionary, finding words, and then I look at the words and I decide if they're the right words. So somehow I'm speaking coherently, I hope so anyway, and somehow I'm conscious and you're conscious of hearing it. but you're not conscious of how you're processing and what associations you're having to it. And I'm not conscious of where the words came from. So no matter what, everything is a mix of conscious and unconscious. That said, the unconscious takes up more of the mix than does the conscious. Conscious tends to be more limited in its scope than the unconscious, simply because you can only do one thing at a time kind of consciously, whereas you can do a million things at a time unconsciously, which I'll get to in a few minutes, in a few seconds, excuse me. The next thing we know is that I use brain and mind interchangeably. So I call it the brain-mind, sometimes I call it the mind-brain. It's not organized rationally, it's not organized cognitively, it's not organized affectively, it's organized dissociatively. I'm going to explain what I mean by that in a minute or two. But very quickly, if I say the word night to you and you pop up with the word day, you didn't pop up with the word day because you said, I wish to discuss the opposite, and the opposite is good. Or you might have said dark, or you might have said moon, or you might have said sun. But it pops. It pops because it's part of an associative network, not because there's any logical coherence to it, except insofar as you learn the network because of logical and coherence. And finally, the brain-mind or the mind-brain operates in parallel. By that, I mean that you're doing a lot of things at the same time. You don't do just one thing and then another thing. We used to have a serial processing model of the mind. So first, information comes into your senses, and then it gets into iconic memory, and then it gets into short-term memory, and then it gets into long-term memory. No. Everything is happening at once, including affect and cognition, and including memory. Okay, so let me elaborate on what I mean by association. As I said, we don't think rationally. We don't think linearly. That's what computers do. And we're not computers. Computers do one thing at a time. They do it rationally. We think associatively. And those associations are grouped in networks that operate outside of our awareness. They operate unconsciously. I'm going to try and demonstrate that to you soon. But in the brain, what we have are associations of neurons in networks. There's dense clumps of neurons. They're sparse clumps of neurons. They're associated with one another. We call that being connected, meaning that one neuron is likely to have another neuron fire. When we translate that to the mind, we have the same kind of network, except in this case, we're linking what we call ideas, thoughts, and feelings. To me, they're the same. This shows you how old I am. I chose 7-Up, which I believe doesn't exist anymore. But it would have affective, connective associations. Maybe it would be enjoyable, refreshing, some positive memory associated with it, and so on. Okay. Now, I said we process information in parallel. And as I said, a lot of things are going on inside our heads at the same time, and we can't possibly be aware of all of that. Now, as I said, computers process things serially, but they do it really fast. Computers operate in nanoseconds. So they can do one thing at a time because they do it so fast. If we did one thing at a time, we would just sit here for hours and get nothing done. So the advantage we have over computers, at least so far, is they operate serially, we operate in parallel. But since we're operating in parallel, we can't possibly be aware of all the things going on inside our head because there's so many things, literally hundreds of things, if not thousands. So most of it has to be unconscious. That leads me to the neurocognitive models, major models of the mind that now exist. They seem to be contradictory. I think that they can be integrated, actually, and I talk a little bit about this. But the major models are called massive modularity, connectionism, really, but the main model of connectionism is parallel distributed processing. And the third, which is more recent, and I think is the better or the best of the three, is called neural reuse. I don't know how much of these you know about, but let's start with massive modularity. So that's, this part of the brain does this, that part of the brain does that. That's what we're talking about. So what you have is many relatively independent sections of the brain that we call modules, all doing their thing at the same time. All of these models have parallel processing in common. And since they're autonomous, since they're independent of one another, that means one module doesn't talk to another module. oftentimes, which means that one can come to a conclusion, if we can call it that, a calculation or whatever you want to call it technically, can come to its endpoint that says one thing, while another one comes to a different, even contradictory conclusion. And since they're independent of each other, they don't try and work it out, so to speak. And we can therefore hold both conclusions at the same time in our head, even if they contradict one another. And we know this is a common aspect of human nature. I can honestly believe something that I tell you and then behave in a totally different way and don't have a problem with it, or I'll rationalize it. So this model therefore requires unconscious processes because you can't possibly know what each module is doing. And most modules are autonomous and working independently of consciousness anyway. So what happens now is history has been turned on its head. The unconscious is the given, and we don't understand consciousness. In fact, Gazzaniga, who's a massive modularity person, and Kurzban, and I can't remember the second author now offhand, were also massive modularity people, posit a module that imitates, you're not really conscious, you don't really have privileged access. Gazzaniga's interpreter just watches what you do and offers an understanding of it just so you can kind of follow what you do and have a vague understanding that sometimes is right and sometimes is wrong. And we see that in our patients. They'll offer you an interpretation or understanding or an explanation of why they do what they do. And you go, I don't think so. And the other one of Kurzban, its job is to smooth social kinds of contacts. And so it makes things, it explains things in terms of stuff that will benefit you socially. But in fact, you don't have any actual privileged access to the inside of your head. So consciousness is actually a problem now. But what comes out of it, no matter what, is conflict is part of the unconscious. It has to be, because these things can come to different ends, to different conclusions. So now we go to parallel distributed processing, abbreviated PDP. McClelland and Rumelhart are the main people here. Rumelhart, unfortunately, passed away, but McClelland is still around. Not my McClelland, a different McClelland. And here's what they say. Well, there are no real modules. What there are really small, what they call units. A unit is just a small collection of neurons. And these units get connected when they fire together. So there's one unit sitting here, another unit sitting somewhere else in the brain. They happen to fire at roughly the same time. And then they get connected such that when one fires, the other one's more likely to fire. That's why it's called parallel and distributed. It doesn't have to be next to each other. It could be in another part of the brain. The more often they happen to fire together, the stronger the connection becomes. They actually measure it. They call it a connection weight. And this is how you learn. This is what learning is. This is implicit learning, namely units firing together and then becoming connected. So that means no unit is tied exclusively to some particular representation inside your brain or mind. Each unit can fire with a bunch of different things, and therefore they can represent an infinite number of entities. Well, what saves this model from being just total chaos is the pattern of units that are activated is what makes for a representation. Otherwise, you would just have a bunch of units firing randomly and you wouldn't know what the hell was going on. And also, some units inhibit each other, some units activate each other, and you end up with some kind of organization. Their technical term is settling on a solution. I won't get into that. So we're not aware that these units are getting connected. So the system is learning, what we would call learning, but it's doing it unconsciously. As I said, we're saved from an infinite number of arbitrary connections because some connections activate others, some connections inhibit others, and that limits the possible pattern, that constrains the possible conclusions that a PDP system can settle on or the solutions it can reach and so on. What that means is you never get a perfect fit. The environment is never exactly the same. So what you get is a kind of an attempt to satisfy as many of the possible constraints going on as possible. So what you get is a compromise, and compromise is central to PDP functioning. And it fills in stuff, and that's why when you proofread, you have a hard time. It'll fill in the missing letter. in the way mostly it's fired together, so you'll miss that you got it wrong. And none of this is in awareness. In fact, as the massive modularity people do, the PDP theorists struggle with consciousness. They don't know what to do about it. There's a guy named Clearmans who tries to talk about it. Frankly, I don't quite understand what he's saying. I hope it's me and not him. But there's some kind of central space that you go to. But be that as it may, unconscious is a given. Consciousness is something to be explained. And finally, neural reuse. And I'm showing circuits on a circuit board. You'll see why in a minute. So what you have now is you have units like PDP has and like massive modularity has, except they are much larger than the small assemblies that PDP has and much smaller than the independent modules that massive modularity has. And so they give it a name, they call it workings. And each working does something specific, just like a module does, but it's much more elementary, much more primitive what it does. And instead of only doing its thing, it can be combined with other workings. And when it is combined with other workings, that's called a use. And so you have an infinite number of possible uses based on an infinite number of possible combinations of workings. Now, most workings are based on evolution and so on, but they can be developed later. Let me give you an example. I refer here to the evolutionary term accepted. And that's a term that means something that we originally evolved for one reason can be co-opted to serve another function. The classical example are feathers. Feathers originally evolved for warmth. If you've ever used a down pillow, you know that, or down blanket, they're really warm because air is trapped within the feathers and you stay warm. And that's why you see dinosaurs nowadays, people think they had feathers, and it wasn't because they could fly. It was in order to preserve heat. But it turns out that the way feathers exist, they can also be used for flight. They don't have to be, bats fly without feathers, but they were accepted for this other function, and then flight evolved. In human beings, for example, we all know how to read and write. Reading and writing came about much too late to be a function of evolution. It could not have evolved. So what had to happen instead was we had to take something that already existed in our mind and brain, co-opt it, combine it with a bunch of other things that we have in our mind and brain, co-opt those, put it together in a new combination, and voila, we have a reading and writing. So we've accepted that, and then we have a bunch of new functions. And you can see that this can be done in a variety of ways, and so on and so forth. And maybe I'll give another example later. Exaption is, this was Gould from Harvard that came up with this concept. Anyway, I'm hoping that I can illustrate it now and show you how it works, because I've been very abstract to this point, so now I'm going to be concrete. And I'm going to try and illustrate these principles by having you participate, which I threatened you with earlier. And so on the next slide is going to be a jar, a depiction of a jar. And that jar is going to be filled with 100 personality descriptions of 100 individual people. 90 of those people depicted in the jar of those descriptions are engineers, 10 are artists. 90 to 10 engineers to artists. Okay. There's the jar, 90-10. I'm going to remove one of the descriptions, and here's where I'm going to need a polling. I'll call for it in a minute. So what does it say? It says creative and emotionally sensitive. So I'd like the polling to go now. Artist or engineer? Choose. And I'll wait a little while. Artist or engineer? I'll play the Jeopardy music. Da, 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 da. Okay, do we have a number? Okay, we have 85% artists and 15% engineers. You can close that now. So virtually everyone said artist. Those of you who said artist, which was 85% of you, are wrong. And I'm going to tell you why. I told you, I said it, I put it up on the screen, I repeated it. 90 of the people were engineers. I said that. That means you should guess engineer, no matter what I tell you that I pulled out of that jar, unless I say something specifically that can only be true of an artist, like I am an artist and not an engineer. No matter what I say, you should guess engineer, and yet you did not. So you don't feel bad. Statisticians do this too. They make the same mistake. So what happened? What happened are all the processes I just demonstrated or talked about to you, except now I've demonstrated it. You relied on your unconscious, implicitly learned associations, and you used them automatically. You didn't think about it, you just did it, despite the information I presented to you. And here's why you did it. This is the association and stereotype to an engineer. This is a character from a sitcom called The Big Bang. The name of the character is Wolowitz, and this is what an engineer is supposed to look like, supposed to be nerdy, supposed to be concrete, supposed to be uncreative. The irony, of course, is this human being is not an engineer. This human being is an artist and is in fact, is an actor and therefore is in fact an artist. And this is what an artist is supposed to look like. This, and most of you realize, is Salvador Dali, and you're supposed to he should be stroking a cat, and he should look crazy like this and be creative. This is reality. This is a bioengineer, one of the top engineers in the country, Mark Salzman. He teaches at Yale. That's an actual engineer. And here's an actual artist. This is a rock star to the rock stars. This is a rock star god, one of the founding fathers of rock and roll, Buddy Holly. Okay, so what happened? Numerically, it was obvious, 90 out of 100. Therefore, logically, it was a no-brainer. You should have picked engineer. That were the odds. Now, here's where it comes in, where it starts to get interesting. Is there anyone here that believes an engineer can't possibly be creative? Because that was one of the attributes. In fact, engineers are almost by definition creative. You have a problem, you don't know how to solve it, an engineer solves the problem. You believe an engineer can't be emotionally sensitive? Really? You can't possibly believe that. And had I done it in reverse, do you think an artist can't possibly be logical and nerdy? So why didn't you guess correctly? It's because you have a preconceived view of artists and engineers. You're not consciously biased. No one here hates engineers or thinks ill of engineers or artists, and yet you judged in a biased way. You judged in a biased way because of your associative networks, because of automaticity, because of implicit learning. Well, who cares? It's artists and engineers, no biggie. Except it's not harmless. If I were to substitute for artist and engineer, African-American and Caucasian, gay and straight, Muslim and Christian, Jewish and Gentile, man and woman, same biases operate. If I ask you, I don't want anyone to answer, but if I ask you, what is the stereotype of an African-American? There's nobody watching me now that doesn't know what they are. I'm not saying you consciously buy them, but you know what they are. What's the stereotype of a Jewish person? You know what they are, and on and on. So what I just demonstrated to you is an unconscious source of bias, stereotyping, and prejudice in a normative process that we all use. And I can explain why it's normally adaptive, but in this case not. So that means that we think in a prejudiced way without realizing it. We keep hearing about implicit bias. You've just demonstrated it, and I've just shown you a little bit of it working live. Okay. Where does it come from? Well, it starts really early, and now I'm going to switch to racial bias. We're bombarded with these associations from childhood on. And I'm going to show you one way prejudice gets into these associative networks through implicit learning, through children's movies. And we're going to start with Dumbo. And Dumbo's been in the news lately, but if you have seen the movie Dumbo, if this was a live audience, I would ask people to tell me, but I can't do that, so I'm just going to tell you. Dumbo is an elephant whose ears are gigantic. Dumbo is ostracized. Dumbo is rejected because he looks different, but it turns out that Dumbo's ears are actually an asset. They enable him to fly. He saves the circus. So the lesson is we should celebrate difference. We should celebrate diversity. We shouldn't judge people. That's great. That's a wonderful message. Children should all have that. Now I'm going to show you the unconscious implicit subtext of the same movie. And it's not the crows. This is a scene no one remembers. It's called Song of the Roustabouts. And I'm going to have the lyrics on the bottom so you don't have to strain your ears listening to them. There we go. I hope you can hear it. Okay, let me let that sink in for a couple of seconds. That's in a very popular movie that children have been watching for decades and nowadays can repeat over and over again if they want to watch it a second time. It's a scene no one remembers. So what's happening? The overt message, the explicit message is celebrate differences in diversity, except if your skin is darker, and then you are represented as being faceless and a beast of burden, unable to read or write, and a hairy ape. And you just saw it. Well, people say to me, you know, the movie was made in 1942, things have changed. Well, that's true, except a child watching this doesn't know when it was made. They're watching it now. And secondly, you think it's different now? Maybe more subtle, and I'm going to show you. I don't know if anyone noticed that Dumbo had blue eyes. Well, how many elephants do you think in the world have blue eyes? I'll give you a clue. None. Elephants don't have blue eyes, but Dumbo had blue eyes. So Dumbo was remade in 2019, just a couple of years ago. And obviously this scene was no longer in it. The famous crow scene was no longer in it. I won't show you a clip, but I'll show you a poster. Here is a poster for the new Dumbo. There he is. He has blue eyes. Now, why in the world would you present an elephant with blue eyes? Because blue eyes are good. And that's, oh, okay, maybe that's just Disney. Disney has this history and so on. Okay, let's move on. Different company, a child's movie called Happy Feet. I picked Happy Feet because it's Dumbo all over again. Instead of an elephant, it's a penguin. Instead of being called Dumbo, the character is called Mumbles. He's moved from being mute to just being Mumbles. And instead of having big ears, the character Mumbles is unable to sing, which penguins value in this movie, but boy, can he dance. And he's ostracized, and he's rejected, and he's made fun of. And in the end, his dancing saves the penguins. Exactly the same plot as Dumbo. Well, let me show you a poster advertising this movie. The hero, Mumbles, is in the front. Lo and behold, Mumbles has a white face and blue eyes. And the other penguins, I won't even get into the Mexican stereotype that's involved in the other penguins. They have dark eyes and black faces. And by the way, there are as many penguins with blue eyes as there are elephants with blue eyes. So then people say to me, well, when penguins are babies, they have white faces, they grow up to have black faces. The character's a baby in this shot. You're like cherry picking. Okay. There's another poster. Now Mumbles is an adult. All the other adult penguins still have black faces. All the other adult penguins have dark eyes. And there's Mumbles with his white face and blue eyes. Now, I don't believe that the creators of these movies sit in the back room, rubbing their hands together and saying, laughing in an evil fashion, saying, we will now foment racism. I think that because of their implicit learning, because of their associative networks, because of the automaticity of it, this looked better, that was their only conscious understanding of it. And in fact, when I've shown these posters to my students, including African-American students, they were shocked. They didn't realize it, they didn't notice it, but it gets inside your head through implicit learning. Finally, and by the way, I could show you Kung Fu Panda also. For the sake of time, I'm not going to do that. Kung Fu Panda, blue eyes, white face, and his teacher also has blue eyes and a white face. It doesn't end. This is a cereal box that was actually pulled for Kellogg's Corn Pops. What you see on the left is the whole cereal box, and all of the characters are having fun, sliding into milk and going up and down stairs, just having a grand old time, except for one. One is cleaning up, one is the janitor. I've blown it up on the right, and lo and behold, he has darker skin and he's the janitor. So there we go. Now I'm going to move to politics. Yeah, I still have a few minutes. Let's see if I can get through all of this. The big dog is the euphemism used for Bill Clinton in politics. And what you see is a photograph of him at the nominating convention of Barack Obama in 2012, giving one of the nomination speeches, which went over terrifically. And why am I picking him? I'm picking him because in the year 2000, Al Gore ran for president and decided not to use Bill Clinton to campaign for him. Why not? Well, Bill Clinton had been impeached. Bill Clinton had cheated on his wife. Bill Clinton had lied to us. So his self-report conscious polling indicated to him that Bill Clinton would not be an asset. My colleague and I, Drew Weston, thought that this was insane. Bill Clinton was a two-term president. Somebody liked him. And if Bill Clinton was presenting on Zoom now instead of me, I would be talking to crickets. But who listens to academics? We tried to call the Gore campaign. Nothing happened. And we didn't have the technology to prove it. But 4 years later, we did. And 4 years later, there was a governor of California named Gray Davis. I'm going to show you that study. And Gray Davis was stuck in a recall election in California. There had been enough signatures on a petition to trigger an election to decide whether to recall him as governor. Bill Clinton offered to campaign for him, and he got turned down for the same reason. So let's take a look. So what we did was we presented, and Dr. Gerber mentioned subliminal. We presented an unconsciously perceived photo of Bill Clinton. We wanted to associate Bill Clinton with Governor Davis. So we presented a Bill Clinton photo that people weren't aware of seeing, and then followed it with a Davis photo that they were aware of seeing. And then we compared that with a condition where we just showed Gray Davis, and that's it. And then we said, rate Davis. We did this a week before the election. We did this in California. We did this online. It got published in the Journal of Political Psychology. We focused, I'm talking fast now because I think I'm low on time, so I'm sorry. We focused on negative evaluations. Why? Because it's a recall election, and also because negative works. Attack ads work. I could talk about why, but they do. That's why people use them, even though everyone says they hate them. And we looked particularly at independents. This is not magic. You're not going to turn a partisan Republican into a Democrat. You're not going to turn a partisan Democrat into Republican, but you can play with the undecideds. And that's who runs elections now anyway. So here are the results. Red is Republican, blue is Democrat, green is independent. On the left is just Gray Davis. And these are negative evaluations. So the bigger the number, the more negative it is. Okay. So as you see, the Republicans don't like Gray Davis. The Democrats are kind of neutral, but they don't really dislike Gray Davis. And the independents really dislike Gray Davis. So he's in trouble. Now we present Bill Clinton associated with Gray Davis. If anything, the Republicans dislike Gray Davis more. It's not statistically significant, but you can see that. Why? Because they don't like Clinton and they don't like Davis. The Democrats show a slight betterment, very tiny, because they like Bill Clinton. But look at the independents. They did a 180. They moved from totally negative to not at all negative. And all we did was show them Bill Clinton. So we came to our grandiose conclusion. But I think the correct conclusion is you need to employ these measures. 12 years later, that first slide I showed you, the big dog is everywhere, was everywhere, stumping for Obama. Everyone agreed he was a huge asset. Was the lesson learned? I put a question mark there because we thought yes at the time, but we were wrong, no. Because Hillary Clinton, who happens to be married to Bill Clinton, decided not to use Bill Clinton. And we did a study that appears on CNN. I won't show you the clip, but if you Google Joel Weinberger CNN, you'll see the clip on CNN. They asked us to assess implicit associations between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in 2016. I'm going to go through this fast. Here are the associations we looked at. We came up with these as personality attributes that are typically associated with politicians, a couple of them unique to these politicians. Negatives were scary, poor judgment, not qualified, mean, and bigot. Positive, shares my values, presidential, likable, competent leader, gets things done, inspiring, keeps us safe, cares about people like me, and genuine. I won't get into the method. I'll leave that unless someone wants to deal with it. Here are the results. Green is good stuff. Red is bad stuff. Look at Trump. Leader is all the way at the top. Bigot's up there. Now remember, these are not reports. These are people's reaction times to things. These are unconscious. These are not things people are telling us. And yet bigot's up there, leaders up there, a bunch of greens. Most of the reds are near the bottom, but all the way at the bottom is likable. Trump is not likable. You think he has a problem, but he is a leader and does share my values. He does keep us safe, blah, blah, and blah, blah. So here's what we said 6 months before the election, and then I'll give you our prediction 6 months before the election. Donald Trump is first and foremost a leader, and although he is presidential, he shares my values, and he can keep us safe, he is also a bigot. He's moderately inspiring. He's also moderately scary. He kind of cares about people, not that much. He's somewhat genuine. He's a little bit mean. I'm not sure if he can get things done or not. I'm not worried about whether he's qualified. That's near the bottom. I don't know if he's competent. That's near the bottom. I'm not worried about poor judgment. That's near the bottom, but likable is near the bottom. That's a problem. Here's our prediction. 6 months ahead in April. People have a lot of positive associations to Trump, but do not find him likable and question his judgment and competence, despite what they see as important assets. He is a flawed candidate, but with a lot of powerful positives. He triggers extreme reactions, both positive and negative, but even his supporters do not see him as likable. He can win. Nobody said he could win. We said it then. But he must counter perceptions of poor judgment to present himself as qualified to get things done, and he has to address not being likable. Okay, now look at Hillary. It's like the perfect storm. Although she shares my values, she's scary and she has poor judgment. Without going into the details, if you look at the mix, there are more reds near the top, and look at the bottom. Likable also at the bottom for her. And in fact, it's worse than Trump's likable. So here's the meaning of those results. Although Hillary Clinton shares my values, she's scary, she's presidential, but there's some worry about her judgment. I think that was the email thing, by the way. Although she does get things done, being qualified is not a problem. She's genuine, but she's also bigoted. Remember, she called people not undesirables, but something along those lines. And she talked against the coal miners. Who cares about people like me, but she can be mean. She's only weakly seen as someone who's inspiring and competent and keep us safe. By far, her weakest association is likable. She has the qualifications to be president, but she's simply not likable, and there's some doubt about her competence and ability to deliver. Remember, this is not my opinion. These are data. Bottom line, Clinton triggers extreme reactions. This is our prediction. You're either for her or against her. It's hard to be on the fence, and it's difficult for anyone, even supporters, to really like her. She will garner pro and anti votes. The anti votes have passion, but there is little passion positively. She can win, but her support is not deep and her support is not strong, which translates into turnout, and she didn't get the turnout and she didn't win. So we looked at 2020. Now it's Trump and Biden. Blue is Biden's strengths or superior. Red is Trump's. Biden is better at getting things done. Biden is more inspiring. Biden is more of a leader. Biden is more likable. Finally, we have someone likable. Trump is more of a bigot. Trump can keep us safe. Remember, there was rioting that he pushed on. Trump cares about me. That depends on who you think me is. And Trump is competent. You remember that Biden is supposed to be demented, according to the campaigns. What does it mean? Biden is more inspiring, more likable, more of a leader. Trump is more competent, cares about me more, and will keep me safe. I explain why. I'll leave it up for a second. Now we predicted that Biden would win, but it wouldn't be a landslide. And we were right again, and the polls were wrong again. Here's the other thing that we looked at. We were able to look at Trump 2016 versus 20. Blue are things that were better in 2020. Gets things done. Well, he had an opportunity to get things done. However, he's now more scary. He was more inspiring back then. He was much more of a leader back then. He has poorer judgment now. He shared my values more back then. He was more presidential back then. He's more likable now, but not by a lot. He kept us safer back then. This shows that he's gone downhill, but has some strength still, and therefore we predicted Biden. So that's me talking Bronx and talking quickly. So let me summarize what I hope I communicated here. Check the time. Yeah, I'm good. Psychology avoided studying the unconscious until relatively recently. We started with Descartes. Now we do it, and we study it in a lot of ways. Unconscious has important implications for everything. I try to emphasize clinical work in politics, and by the way, bias. It affects everything. 3 basic principles are that our minds are associatively organized, our minds operate in parallel, and there's nothing pure about conscious or unconscious. And I'm done. I'm ready to take questions. Sorry for rushing at the end. I'll stop sharing. And I'm ready. Thank you, by the way. Thank you for having me.
Amir, could I jump in and ask a first question?
Yes, please go right ahead. I'd like you to lead us off.
Sure. Well, first of all, just thank you, Joel. I mean, that's just a tour de force. I mean, you cover so much material, and it you know, of course I'm a little biased, but consciously and unconsciously, I just think you're speaking to you know, sense about the human mind. But I have a question. Maybe it's a little bit more of a political, but in a different way question. As you know, and as I often talk about, if you open up a cognitive neuroscience journal today, it looks very different than a cognitive neuroscience journal 20 years ago. That I can't imagine any journal now not having at least one article, and sometimes it's the whole journal, on various kinds of unconscious processes. They rarely use the word unconscious. As you said, they use all these other synonyms like implicit or, you know, other things. But it's become almost just, I mean, I would imagine if you're a cognitive neuroscience student today, you would be surprised at the history that you just described if you weren't a scholar of the history of the field, because you would just think, of course, everybody thinks about the unconscious all the time. So I guess my question for you is, do you feel that steady progress, or do you feel that, as I've heard others say, it's kind of gotten warped, that we've lost something about a more dynamic unconscious, and that what people talk about implicit isn't quite as robust as the kind of unconscious that you've been studying your whole career?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that both are true. I think it's a good thing that we're studying implicit, but if you read the cognitive neuroscience literature, it's like me picking up a cup and doing relatively mundane, unimportant things. And if you want to learn about something that's more relevant, you have to go to the social psychologists. They're not doing it. And unfortunately, the clinical psychologists don't seem to know this. So I'm trying to publish articles in clinical journals talking about this stuff because I agree, the dynamic unconscious has been forgotten. Whereas I think the dynamic unconscious exists. I thought so my whole career, obviously. But I think that it's because the normative unconscious has gone off the rails to some degree, not that there's something specially going on where conflict has happened because your mother didn't treat you right or something. So I think that the field has gone in the direction of implicit rather than, they don't like the word unconscious. I'll quickly tell the story. I was working with Dave McClelland. We sent in this paper and it got torn apart. It was like, you deserve to die. You should leave the field. You're a horrible person. How dare you send us this paper? And I was crestfallen. And David is looking at it going, okay, go through it and change the word unconscious to implicit and change the word conscious to self-attributed. I said, why, David? He said, it's not my first rodeo. Do what I'm telling you. So we did it and we sent it back. Other than a couple of tweaks, that's all we did. And it came back a second time as a tour de force and got published in a journal called Psychological Review. So that bias against the dynamic unconscious is still with us, unfortunately. I hope I've addressed what you asked me. Okay.
That's wonderful. And I wanted to thank you again also for coming, Dr. Weinberger. I found it really interesting because I have a son and I was watching Disney Plus with him and we were watching Peter Pan. And I don't know if you realize there's this whole thing with Native Americans. And it's incredibly offensive. And I turned it off. I said, I can't. I was like, there's a point where you can say, well, it's a sign of the times, but I just found it really interesting because I've seen Dumbo too, and I had no awareness of it. It's something you miss. In terms of questions, right now we're waiting on some more questions, but someone did ask an interesting question. I find it funny. Is it the person asked, did you hit your child surgeon after the surgery?
No, because we had to meet with him a couple of weeks later to see how the surgery had gone. But I was as angry as I sounded when I talked about it. I really was angry. But he had the sewing needles and the knife, and I needed him to do a good job, and he was ignorant. And what could I do? But I was angry. I was as angry as I said I was. But no, I did not hit him. Now, had this been in the Bronx, maybe I would have hit him. That's where I'm from, but I did not. It's a funny question.
We have a question from Dr. Michael Grote, our clinical chief. He said, thank you, Dr. Weinberger, a truly impressive presentation on the state of the art of understanding the role of unconsciousness in daily functioning. He asked, what do you see as future directions?
Oh, the $64 question. I think what has to happen is all our clinical theories, I hope I'm not getting too controversial here, but I'll say it, are like decades old, and what we do is we tweak them. I think we need to start again, and we need to incorporate what we now know into our clinical theories and stop worrying about whether we're cognitive behaviorists or psychoanalysts and just, we know stuff that works. We know what the literature says. I think it's time to start testing those things in clinical settings and come up with a better way to help the people that we want to help instead of retreating to our silos and doing meta-analyses that end up showing that they're all the same.
So thank you for that. I have another question. Someone asked, will you please explain again the affect versus cognitive process that patients bring to their sessions?
Yeah, I was really more talking about a conflict within the clinical and the academic community. There's been this conflict about what has priority, cognition or affect. And some people say cognition has priority and affect will follow. And some people say affect has priority and cognition is amended so as to fit the affect. And then they sit around arguing about it. And Zions did this with Lazarus in the academic world. I think in the cognitive therapy versus psychoanalytic world, there's, I'm going to focus on maladaptive cognitions. No, I'm going to focus on affective reactions. And I think that this is an argument that doesn't need to happen, that it depends. And people ought to realize that it depends. And your patient will tell you what it depends on, because the story they'll tell you will feature one of those things. What do they notice the most? And what do they try to explain the most in terms of their self-image? And I think that that's the part to focus on, as opposed to have a preconceived notion, about like I grew up psychodynamically, and I, find the affect, find the affect, find the affect. If they just tell you, then it's not real, it's not affectively meaningful. And then I studied a bit of cognitive therapy with people I thought were good, and they said, look for the inconsistencies and look at the way they distort things cognitively and point those out. And every time, it's the old Yiddish joke. Every time someone said something to me, I said, you're right. You're absolutely right. And then the other person said the opposite. And I said, you're right. You're absolutely right. And then I realized, well, maybe they are both right, as opposed to I have to pick one. And I think that we somehow live in a binary dichotomous world. We see that politically, but I think that's also true academically and clinically, where we have to pick. And what we should pick is what works and what helps people. And I don't know if I'm answering the question that he was trying to pose, but that's really the $64 question. Where do we go from here?
Thank you. I think we have time for at least one more question. Someone asked, to give an example about your son and the surgeon, and he said, utilizing this example with your son having discomfort with door slamming, if you have a client who has an extreme implicit reaction from such an event, what somatic approach rather than cognitive approach would you find best addressed in helping their symptoms?
That's a good question. I have to think of it. I guess I would ask them to focus on their feelings and thoughts, and ask them to associate to it, to see what the associative network looks like, and see what affect is connected to it and what thoughts are connected to it. I have not done that with my son. I try to avoid psychoanalyzing my children. But if I were to use him as an example, he might start saying, loud sounds can depict something harmful or dangerous. There's an old story about Claparède, the French psychiatrist, holding a pin between his fingers. I don't know if you know the story. And there was a woman suffering from Korsakoff's on the ward. So she had no memory, no explicit memory. And he shakes her hand and stabs her with the pin, at which point she curses him out. He shows up the next day. She has no recollection of it. He sticks out his hand to shake hands with her again. And she says, I'm not shaking hands with you. He goes, well, why not? She says, well, I don't know what you have in your hand. Maybe you could harm me. So she's evidencing an implicit memory, associatively understood. So I would look at the associative network around the problem, the fear, or whatever it is, and try to understand it from the patient's point of view. That's the way I would first approach that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. I don't know, Dr. Gerber, if you have any other questions before we wrap things up.
Oh, I got a million, but I think I'll save them for some other time. But I'm just so appreciative, Joel, of you spending time with us and sharing this. And for what it's worth, I think your vision is exactly the right vision. Now the trick is, how do you convince people to give up their sectarian stubbornness? Because, right, I mean, that's what drives us in the political realm, but it also drives us in the field. Why do social psychologists feel it's more important to differentiate themselves from clinical psychologists than to find something that truly works for everybody?
I don't know.
It's
It's
not
a
just-
problem. It's a problem in my work. I have a problem because I speak to diverse audiences, and once I mention psychoanalysis to social psychologists, their minds turn off. And once I mention social psychology to clinicians, their minds turn off. Max Planck, many years ago, maybe I could end with this, said, "People don't change their minds; they die, and then a new generation shows up that's more open." Hopefully, it won't require a lot of death because I don't have that many years to go myself. But it might be that you can't change people. They're invested in who they are and what they do, and you're asking them to change. And as clinicians, we all know how much our patients like to change. Well, neither do the professionals like to change.
Well said.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weinberger. And I want to let everybody know that you can, the screen's going to pop up and you'll be able to get access to the survey to do your CME. So thank you so much for attending.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Again, I wish I could be physically there, and hopefully I will be one day and visit all of you and see you in 3D. But I really appreciate you having invited me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Joel.